Welcome to our next session. And now we have Scott MacArthur, who is the founder of Sculpture LTD. And Scott has extensive experience with employee experience, employee engagement, and he will be speaking about new perspectives on measurement post-COVID. So welcome, Scott. Thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You can write your questions in the chat box, as always. We will come back to your questions as soon as Scott is done, and we'll have a question and answer session. And yeah, we will come back to your questions. So thank you, Scott. Good luck, and I'll see you in a bit.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me for this short talk. I'm not used to speaking for only 30 minutes, so it will be a challenge for me to try and not speak for more than 30 minutes. So welcome, and welcome to those also who are watching this on a recording. I really appreciate you coming along. I'm going to start this session by getting you to do something, and I want you to do a little quiz for me. Now, it doesn't take long, it only takes a few seconds, but I'm going to show you a grid of numbers. And what I would like you to do is, there's 45 numbers on this grid. I'd like you to see how many you can spot in order. So 1, 2, 3. And let's see how far you can get in 10 seconds. So ready, steady, go. Time's up. Now, if you want, you can put how many you got to in the chat box, but let me show you how you could have got to almost 45 in that short period of time. If I had done this and asked you to count, how far do you think you would have got? So we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Thank you. Well done. Who's got there? David, well done. You got to 8. That's really good. And Ollie, 5's pretty good as well. Well done. But what I've just done is I've added a frame to a complex picture. And what I'm hoping to do in this short talk is to give you a frame over which you can place your thinking and your organization, and maybe even yourself, when we think about the world post-COVID. Now, my background is appropriate to give you a little bit about it. This is me when I was just a young man, and this is Amanda, my assistant. She was actually a baboon that I spent a year and a half. I was given her when she died in Edinburgh Zoo, and I spent a year and a half creating this skeleton from poor old Amanda. And my speciality was in measurement, so I was very interested in things like this is a piece of bone that I worked on, and I was very interested in measurement. Now, after my time as a scientist, it became obvious that I had to move on, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. So I started to look for my next step. Now, I'd left science with what I think is the classic definition of science. I had in my head a structure which is called organisational curiosity. And that led me to move from human remains, because I was working with human remains, to human resources. Now, that's my best line, so I hope some of you giggled at that point. But that happened to me, and I ended up spending 15 years working mainly in the UK and France for organisations like utility companies. I worked in education, construction, and I worked in the drinks industry for some time. Then I moved on to my what turned out to be my final HR director's role, which was in a food company. And I was actually working in the far north of Scotland at the time, in a place called Fraserburgh. If there are any Scots in the room, we call it the Broch. And during that time, something else happened to me. And I ended up moving out of the HR function. I was approached by one of the big four to become a consultant. Now, I know some of you may recoil at that, and for good reason. But nevertheless, this was a huge opportunity for me, and led me to many, many years of terrific experience where I traveled all over the world. And this picture, I chose this deliberately because one of the things that you learn in consulting very, very, very early on is the importance of time. You're on the clock, you're charging clients all the time for your work, and you're there to provide value at all times. Now, that was a good start, and I kind of understood that. over the next few years, I worked all across the world, and I became aware of this idea here, which is an idea of scalable efficiency. Now, let me help you by explaining what that actually means. This is a picture, incidentally, of where I was born. It's a place called Lanark. And in Lanark, it was one of the places in Europe where we actually invented organizations. We invented the welfare processes. We invented, in effect, HR was one of the places, not just here, but one of the places where it was invented. So it was in my blood, if you like. But scalable efficiency is what companies are all about. An individual can only do so much. And when we come together in groups, we can create more. Now, this is quite important, isn't it? Because we've got big challenges and we've got services and products we need to provide to our clients, and a single individual can rarely do that. But during my time working with scalable efficiency and working with different organizations, and that would go from military organizations to public sector organizations, I worked on 2 Olympic Games, I started to see some issues. Now, initially, it was where I was working in the creative elements of organizations. So, for example, I worked in a group called the Bright Sparks, and I worked in a group called the Impact Team, and I worked in a group called the Dot. And I started to wonder why these organizations seem to continually be looking outside for talent. And I started to see something, and this has only become clear in the last few months, I think. I mean, I talk about this when I talk about the workplace of the future, but I call it the coefficient of inefficiency. There's something about companies that when they get to a certain size, they start to be less efficient. Now, a colleague of mine called Robin Dunbar has researched this, and Robin's based just close by to where I'm speaking to you now. And you may have heard of Dunbar's number. And what Robin suggests is that once we get over 120 people in any one network, things begin to break down. And I have to say, I was starting to see that. And I worked in over 200 organizations, and I increasingly saw, and more commonly saw, and I'm sure some of you have experienced that as well. And it's always interesting when you hear companies talking about, let's procure some skunk works, or let's procure some external thinking, despite the fact they may have thousands of people working for them. So there's something there that's going on that I think is actually very interesting. I then saw this guy. Now, I was very lucky to see Warren Buffett live. Now, if you don't know who Warren is one of the most successful business people in the world. I'm not sure I'm a big fan of what he does, because he's a banker and he buys and sells things. It's not really my thing. I'm more a maker than a banker. But I saw him speak, and I didn't ask this question, but someone said to him, Warren, what's the biggest issue in organizations today? And in a flash, he sort of put his glasses down like this and went, I'll tell you what it is. And he said, it's people checking people, checking people, checking people. And you know what? In that moment, I realized that perhaps that was the coefficient of inefficiency that I was seeing in organizations. So what does that mean? Well, it was funny because I remember sitting in a premises in a city in the UK called Bath. And my managing partner at the time came up to me, and he was giving me some feedback on some work that I'd done for the client. It was a fairly simple piece of work. It was a skills profiling job I was doing. And he came up to me and he said, Scott, this is good. He said, but what you need to do is provide our clients with more thud factor. Now, I didn't know what thud factor was. I was like, well, what's that, Bob? I've got no idea what you're talking about. He just said, you have to make it feel like more value. Now, that was difficult for me at the time. I remember thinking, you want me to lie, or you want me to say things that don't need said. And that set me on a path ultimately to do what I do now, which is talk about the workplace of the future through the eyes of the employees. But I think that moment was the one that crystallized it all for me. And I realized that Parkinson, who you may never have heard of, but Parkinson said this. He said, work expands to fill the time available for its completion. Perhaps Parkinson had it absolutely right. Our companies get to a point where they become inefficient, and although we are still growing, we tend to work harder in our effort to produce something, but actually it's about time rather than anything else. Now, I know that's quite contentious, but I'd like you to think about it, because I think that could be a generative statement that could really help you think about what we do post-COVID. So is this an opportunity for us to reboot our organisations? Well, there's a lot of talk about this, and I think a lot of that is quite naive. I think a lot of it is quite hopeful. But hey, what's wrong with a bit of hope? So how I'm going to move this on is to, again, tell you another story about some of the things I've seen that I think we can learn from, and we can actually embed these into our thinking, at least, when we go back into the post-COVID world. Now, one of these experiences was involved in something I was way back. This was before what I think we now call evidence-based HR or evidence-based organisations. Now, of course, that's not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. And I used to talk about this. I used to talk about the physics of organisational measurement. And I was talking about this 20 years ago when I was taking the scientific principles that I described to you earlier into companies. And it kind of made sense. But then I had a moment of realization when my scientific training and my HR experience and my transformation experience all came together. I knew as a scientist that we could predict the behaviors of the stars. We could say, you know, today at this time to a picosecond, there's going to be something happening in the sky. We know that. And people talk about and lord up physics as if it's something really spectacular. And it kind of is. But there's a reason why there's a but there. I'm trained as a biologist, and I know that that may well be the case, but it might surprise you that we can maybe work out what's happening in the cosmos, folks, but we have very little idea how a mouse works. It's so complex working with human beings and animals, or whatever it is you're working with. It's way more complex than physics. And if truth be told, if you look at this, this is a picture of a cell. We have 30 trillion of these cells in our bodies. And when people say to me, well, I understand the human brain, which has got 87 billion cells in it, I just look at them and I think, I'm not sure if you do. The reason for that is, and it's back when I was at university, I remember the most scary part, the most difficult part of any biologist training is when they have to learn about the cell. It is unbelievably complex. And someone actually said to me recently that every cell in the human body, and there are 30 trillion of those. Now, I can't even work out what that number means. Someone said to me it was this number of stars in the Milky Way. But each one of those cells is as complex as Paris. Think about it. Each one of those cells is complex as Paris. And we are constantly trying to understand how all these cells work together in the human brain, and then to try and understand how it works in groups, and then to try and understand how it works in organizations. So is it any wonder that there are issues with organizations, with the complexity of organizations? But this is where I think we have an opportunity. And there's a couple of things here that I think are quite important. One of my stock sayings when I'm speaking on the keynote stage is this: it's radical simplicity. I think organizations need to start thinking with radical simplicity. Now, what I'm not saying here is that you should ignore detail. What I am saying is I think we've got to a level of maturity in organizations that perhaps we can make it simpler rather than making it more and more complex. Because, and there's a really important reason for this, if you do it the other way around, you make something simple before you understand the complexity, that tends to not work. So I'm very keen on talking to people and explaining to people what I mean by radical simplicity. So let me expand upon this. I have spotted a toxin, and I think some of you, if you're honest, will have spotted the same toxin in our organizations. And that toxin, I believe at the moment, is key performance indicators. We've taken it to a point where we've gone too far. Now, I am not saying we shouldn't have indicators. I am not saying we shouldn't measure. In fact, I'm going to give you some measures in a minute. But I think organizations are losing their way. There's a saying you may have heard, that the tail is wagging the dog. And I think sometimes we do these things. Well, I know from working in 200 organizations that sometimes the indicators are seen as more important than the employee experience, or in fact the customer experience or the service that you're providing to your customers. Now, how do we make sense of that? You know, what do we do with that? Well, there's a few things. First of all, in the light of COVID, it's kind of brought this into a certain degree of focus. But I like this. This is a cartoon that I can't actually find the source, so forgive me if you wrote it and I am quoting you, but I can't find it. But the cartoon says, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Now is obviously quite cutting. It's quite sad. And I think the issue of shareholder value is one of these things that starts to become a problem. It becomes a problem when it becomes seen as the driving force for organizations. Now, I remember working in a large IT company. We had 80,000 people across the world. And the biggest issue we faced was the fact that the chief executive at the time decided that we would start reporting our numbers to the city in London. That's actually in Paris, sorry. Our numbers to Paris every quarter. So a huge part of the business became focused on writing reports for the city. Now, I'm not saying we don't need to do that. And again, we need investment. But nevertheless, I think the focus of organizations has been moved to a point now that I think we could be losing our way. I'm not sure if anyone has experienced that. If you have, stick it in the comments and we can have a word about it at the end. But I think it's something that organizations really, really have to think about. So where are we getting to? Well, look, whoops, we've got this complicated thing. Here's my all expenses spared brain with 87 billion cells in it. Each one as complicated as Paris. What do we do? How do we start to think about this in the context of COVID? Well, there's a number of things. The first thing is, and this is a picture from a British television program, which took place in the late 70s. That'll show you my age. And they spoke in that program, it was called Tomorrow's World, about what it would be like to go to work in the year 2020. And this is what they thought would be going to work like. Now, I'm not normally one for huge amounts of speculation, but I think the arrival of COVID has meant that maybe some of these things can be speculated upon in hope, if nothing else. But nevertheless, I think we've got an opportunity to reboot our organizations here. Now, the first thing I'd like to suggest to you is a new KPI. Now, this would be a KPI that I'd like to sit at the top of organizations. This would be something that every organization would be aspiring to. It's ROH, return on humanity. This is something that is going to be very difficult for many people to get their heads around. And you know what? I don't know the answer. I don't know how that would be considered appropriate. I don't know how that would be measured yet. I've got an idea, but I'm still not sure about it. But I think in light of what's happened with COVID, what's happened with some of our, well, organizations that I was in love with, I mean, Harvard, Virgin, etc., who have really let us down, I think it's fair to say, and I don't think that's controversial, particularly Harvard, who laid off all their lowest paid people, the people who needed help, and kept on their senior tenured people. And Harvard is a university with $40 billion in the bank. So there are things that are happening in organizations that I think they need to take a good, sharp look at themselves. But there's something related to this that I think is worth revisiting. And again, I'm almost aiming a gun at my own head here because I've done this in many, many companies. And it's about trying to get people to engage with an organization, you know, trying to get people to understand how each other's needs and wants, etc., can be met. Now, one of my favorite movies is a movie called Interstellar. And if you've never seen it, I'm really jealous. I wish I'd never seen it because I would love to watch it for the first time again. But at one point in the movie, and they're debating why we should be in on different planets and what we should be doing. And don't worry if you don't like sci-fi, but there's a quote in it that I love. And it says this, it says, empathy rarely extends beyond our line of sight. And I think one of the things, and this is why I'm willing to speculate, is that COVID has shown that social media, technology, the traditional media, maybe not so much, but that has extended our level of sight, and we're becoming much more empathetic about people across the world, not just in our company, but across the world. That's quite exciting, and I think it could be fundamental in changing how we behave moving into the post-COVID world. Now, I had a funny experience, but one that I'm now revisiting and thinking more and more about. I was working in the far north of Scotland for 7 or 8 years. And it was in the year 2000 actually, and we just won 80 million pounds to build a new university. And I know some of you were involved in that. They're on the line here because I know some of my ex-colleagues are here. So thanks for joining us. And Ollie, yeah, what have you said there? Also, your favourite movie, yeah, Interstellar is terrific. Sorry. So let me tell you what happened, because we got the money from the government, the UK government, 80 million pounds. To build this new university, a new collegiate university. And as part of that, because I was on the board, all the board members had to do some, I guess you would call it community service. Not in the criminal sense, but we had to do some community service. And actually, it turns out that they asked me to do my community service in a local prison. Now, that prison is called Peterhead. In Scots, it's called Peterhead. And Peterhead Prison is famous in the United Kingdom, at least, because that's where all the murderers and rapists go. So in that particular prison, there are 300 or 400 murderers and rapists. They asked me, and I remember at the time, I mean, this is 20 years ago, so I wasn't particularly old or experienced at the time, but they asked me if I would go into Peterhead Prison and teach them values. And I was like, and I call this my Johnny Cash moment. Those of you of a particular age will know that Johnny Cash, who's a very famous country rock singer, had a very particularly great album in a prison called San Quentin, where he performed in front of a whole load of people on death row. So the people I was talking to weren't quite as bad as that. But I have to say, I was terrified. And I stood up with these 300 men in front of me, and we had them in little tables. And I asked them, I gave them an exercise to discuss what their values were around the table. And to be honest, they really took it seriously. And I mean, I had a guard on each side of me, well, just off to the side, and I didn't feel too worried about it. But I was worried that they wouldn't be engaged with me. But they did. They got right into it. I guess if you're serving a life sentence or multiple life sentences, there's not that many things you can do, and one of them is education. So anyway, they got thinking about it. After about an hour, and I'd given them a structure, and I asked them to report back. On the screen here, some of these values and corporate belief type things might be yours, but you know what? This is what the prisoners said to me. They said to me that their values, their beliefs were based on honesty, trust, teamwork, integrity, etc. Now, I then remember working for 10 years on value workshops and trying to get organizations to align their values with their strategy. And these words come up all the time. And I know some of you do this. I know some of you have got these as your values. And there's an issue with this. I think certain organizations, and maybe even the majority, I know that's quite a contentious thing to say, but I think a lot of organizations just make up these words and think they're the right things to say. They don't actually think about it in terms of what the outcomes will be. And I mean, this is a desperate example. And if anyone is here from Virgin, I'd love to hear what you think. But I was almost in tears because, I mean, I don't believe in benchmarking for reasons that if you want to talk about it, I'll do that. But one of the few companies that I have looked up to for many years is Virgin. And I've had the pleasure of working at Virgin Media, and I've worked on the Virgin trains. And their company motto is one that was rare, but their company motto was employees first. And I always thought that was terrific. I loved it. And I mean, the evidence behind that is significant. Organizations that focus on their employees before customers tend to be more successful. I know some folk think that's contentious. That's just the evidence. But nevertheless, I looked up to that organization. But during the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, it seems like Virgin maybe just said that and didn't really mean it. Now, I hope that's not true. Certainly when I worked in Virgin Media and Virgin Trains, it was true. They really did care about their people, and they really did care about welfare, etc. But I don't know. But I'd like you to think about it, because I think there's something in here that we can learn about post-COVID. And I've got a comment here from David. Prisoners have pretty much the same values as non-prisoners. Their behaviour is just being encouraged in the prison and labelled as bad. Well, you could be right, David. Maybe we could talk about that another time. I think that's an interesting comment. Thank you very much. But let me take that to the next level, because I think that values and goals are really important. But without supporting processes that drive the appropriate behaviours, they're quite frankly delusional. And I see that delusion a lot. I see it in individuals who are engaged with me when I'm coaching and mentoring them, where they have these there's another Scottish word, highfalutin, these high ideas about where they want to be, but they wonder why things don't change. Well, if you don't put the processes in place that support those, you're deluding yourself. You're just kidding yourself, and you're going to end up in a very difficult place. That's perhaps a subject for another talk, but nevertheless, it's something that I think we should be thinking about post-COVID. So we built up this idea of return on humanity, but I want to actually give you something that then makes it into something practical, makes you start to think about processes. And this number is important. This is one of my favorite numbers. I call it a magic number. And as you see there, it's the average number of days that we live. Now, I think given what's happened with COVID, what's happening in the media, what's happening in our organizations, I think this could be something that could help us bring that return on humanity to life. Let me explain. So if you're doing anything, including this webinar, and you're thinking, I'm not enjoying this, or it's not adding value to me, why would you spend your time? Why would you waste your time involved in that particular space, in that particular webinar? One of my clients is a very well-known high street brand in the United Kingdom. And their toxins, they have the KPI toxins. I assure you, they have a huge problem with KPIs. But the other problem they have is they have too many meetings. It is extraordinary how they get any work done at any one point, because they're always stuck in meetings. And I've said to them at every meeting, in your head, ask yourself, is this appropriate? Am I spending my time well in this particular meeting? And that has led me to, I mean, one of my other areas of expertise is in technology, and there's a fella in technology called Tristram Harris. And Tristram, if you've not heard of Tristram, please Google him and find him, or contact me and I'll send you some links. Tristram is in the vanguard of trying to help organizations who are working with tech to understand the value of tech and helping people spend their time well. And he talked about this idea of everything we do with technology should be time well spent. Well, I actually think, and I have taken Tristram's idea, and I think it could be extended to everything in life, everything in our organizations. And I think that what we don't want is this. We don't want people post-COVID being stuck at home, surrounded by technology. Be at home appropriately, use the appropriate technology, but rather than being like this wee guy, and this is the wee guy I have on my business card, rather than being like this wee guy, I would like us to think about, okay, how do we make sure that every activity that we do post-COVID, we should have been doing it before, but we weren't, we were distracted. How do we make sure that everything we do at work or at home or with your own personal development is time well spent? And I call that the golden KPI. The only thing I can think of that's more important than that is return on humanity. And we can have the debates about return on investment, and we can have the debates about profit. But this is about trying to encourage people to think differently about the post-COVID world. And I would love to think that we could implement a new way of thinking that would be fundamentally based on the bettering of humanity. And to do that, to operationalize that, I'd like us to start to think about, how do we do things that are time well spent in our organizations? How can that golden KPI influence everything we do? I'm going to end with a little example. Now, this is something that, there are a few companies that I, apart from Virgin, who I still think are getting this right. Very, very few, but there are a few. One of them is a British company called Thompsons. Thompsons is a smallish organization. It's about 30,000 people. Who it's a shoe company. They repair shoes, make keys, etc., etc. It's only 20 miles from where I'm living, actually, where they're based in Stratford-upon-Avon. And John Timpson, who's the third generation owner of the company, when he joined Timpsons, he said, "We're making this far too complicated." So what he did, the first thing that he did was he took out all the tills over their 350, 380 shops across the country. They were all SAP-linked tills. They were all linked to the supply chain. He took them all out, and he went down to a warehouse in London, and he bought Victorian tills, and he put them into all the shops. And then he said to all the employees, right, we have two rules here. Look the part and put the money in the till. Talk about radical simplicity. And even more amazing than that, and I started that earlier on, I was talking about prisons. 30% of Timpson's employees are ex-convicts. So even with a 30% ex-convicts population, he trusts them by signaling to them, put the money in the till and look the part. Now, doesn't get it perfect. He's got some issues with, I think he's got some HR issues actually around how he manages some of the performance of people, but nevertheless, he trusts them. to get on with their job. And I love that just as a way to start thinking. Now, I know that most of you are in much more complex businesses than that, but nevertheless, hopefully it helps you start to think about it. The other one, though, is a much larger organisation, huge organisation. And this is the British Navy. And it's actually specifically our submarine part of the British Navy, and it's actually specifically the nuclear submarine part of the British Navy. I've had the pleasure of working with the Third Sea Lord and his team for I think it was about 5 years I was in there. And we talked a lot about what they did, how they did it. They were building new submarines at the time, which were costing £2.3 billion to build. There were 4 of them, so it was a huge project. And I'm not comfortable with nuclear weapons. I'm not comfortable with nuclear submarines. However, the good news is that picture that you can see in front of you there, that picture there, was actually drawn by the fella who was in charge of the UK's button that would fire off our nuclear weapons. He said his job was to help maintain justice and protect the world. Now, that again is just words, you could say, but I know from my experience that they push those words all the way down through their organisation. And I know to this day, they still believe that is what their purpose is in this world. So thank you very much for listening. My time is up. I hope you found that interesting. So there's 3 things just to remind you. I'd like you to think about the reality of corporate values. Are you just saying them, or do you really mean them? And if you really mean them, how are you putting processes into place? Could post-COVID give us an opportunity to think about our KPIs in a different way? Could we think about what the return on humanity is for everything we do? And could the golden KPI, time well spent, be an opportunity for you to think about every step in your employee and customer experience in a very different way? I hope you found that interesting. I think we've got some time for any questions if you want to put them in the chat box. Thank you ever so much for joining me today. And if you want to follow me, point your camera at that QR code. That's my YouTube channel. And on that channel, I talk mainly about the employee experience, but I also talk about things like men's health. I talk about wellness, etc., etc. So there's a whole range of things you can do there. If you point your camera at it, no app required, just point your camera at that screen. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. So when I was listening if anyone has any questions, write it in the chat, feel free. So I have a question about the values when we were talking about corporate values. Yeah. So sometimes there are situations where the leaders in the organizations are not really following those values themselves. Yeah. And what could HR people do to change this this view, position, their point of view? What can HR do to change that? Because when the leaders don't really value what they have, don't really follow those values, it doesn't really reflect on their employees. So my question would be, what could HR do?
I think that's a really interesting question. Thank you very much. I think the best way to face up to that is to give you an example. I was working in an IT services business, and they were having significant issues with employee engagement. They were having significant issues with retention, despite having all these, fancy words on the wall, integrity, career development, all this sort of thing. So I was asked by the HR director and actually the chief exec. So I was lucky that there wasn't that difficult discussion between the HRD and the chief exec, but they asked me what I could do. And I was running a team at the time called the Impact Team, and I thought, okay, how do we make an impact here? Rather than letting the board create the values, let's get the people in the business create the values. So we did, and we hired a large hotel in London. We got 400 people from the business. It was a cross section throughout the business, and we asked them to tell us, how they would like us to run, how they would like us to operate. And I'll tell you the bit. I mean, it was great because we came up with values and they were interesting, and we made them think about, how we're going to operationalize that. What I was saying earlier, I really mean that. And we really have to think about it, not just pay lip service to it, really mean it. But I'll tell you the bit that I think perhaps made it really happen, because they then lasted for 5 years and were seen as part of a significant growth spurt that organisation had. I got the chief executive and I said to her, I said, look, if you're serious about this, you have to take this. You have to listen and do it and believe it. And even more than that, and I got her, I mean, she was very uncomfortable with this, but I said to her, I said, look, you need to get up with a pen in your hand, and I mean it physically, and sign off these new values. And this was after a couple of days, and they'd come up with these new values, and she struggled with that, but she did it. And then every 6 months after that, we got them back together again, and we went through, how are we doing? And we reported back, and she had it's a real challenge for her. I mean, she was working with a very difficult chairman, who was very, very focused on return on investment and on shareholder value. She was responding to what our people said. That business went from £500 million to £2 billion in 4 years. And it wasn't just down to that, but that was certainly, she'll tell anyone to this day that was part of it. So you can do it. But I'm not underestimating another part of your question, which I've not answered, is how do you get the board to buy into the HR professional's perspective on that? And I understand that, and that is difficult.
Yeah. Okay. And what do you think? How can organizations right now with the remote working, as many are going through it right now, especially the other day I read about Twitter, letting all employees work remotely forever. Yeah. So this office culture is also kind of fading away in a way. And I'm thinking, what would be your suggestion for organizations to fortify their values through this remote working system?
Yeah, right. I mean, this is an area, again, I touched on it when I was speaking. I think there's some nonsense, delusional behaviours in organisations, and actually in some people's heads, because I'll go back to my biology, we are tribal creatures. We do not want to be stuck in a study with technology all around us. You'll end up like that little guy that I talked about in my talk. Mm-hmm. And you may well currently enjoy working from home, and I do. I mean, I work from this little office myself all the time, and I love it. But we have to somehow maintain the human contact. Do you know, there was a book by E.M. Forster, who you may have heard of, writing in the 18th century. And in 1909, he published a book called The Machine Stops. And it was all about how human beings had all ended up living in little pods under the ground because the world was so polluted. And the only way we could communicate was via this thing through the ether, because it was 1909, for the internet. And everything we did was done in that little pod. And that story was about how we escaped from that hell. So I think companies have got to be blended in their approach. I think they've got to be careful that they don't jump. I mean, I'm very uncomfortable with the word pivot. I think it's overused. And companies are jumping from one thing to the other. Let's just wait and see. Let's just wait and see what the good things are, what the bad things are. I mean, one thing that's definitely good is the technology like this is getting better. I mean, I've been using Zoom for years and it's rubbish, but it's really improved in the last 6 months. And then coincidentally, in the last 2 months, it's got really good. So some of the technology is starting to improve, and that's a good thing. But I think companies are delusional if they think they can operate completely effectively, just online. There are some examples, but it's a rare thing. And I think humans need human contact. I know I do. I couldn't function without it.
Yeah, of course. But I'm just thinking about the people who are not really, for example, good with the technology, which is obvious that there's such people. And how can they feel, because I think they kind of losing the connection with their culture. Yeah. If there is one in the organization, they're kind of losing it. So in this situation, as they're sitting at home, what do you think would be the best for HR people to do for them? Is it maybe a training?
Difficult question.
Or something around those lines?
Okay, well, I think the first thing is don't over-communicate. A lot of companies are blasting out newsletters every day. They're having Zoom calls every couple of days. And I don't know about everyone else, but I very quickly got fatigued by the online meetings. I've gone from having one or two every couple of hours to having one or two a week. Because I just can't sit on these things for any more than a few hours. I was talking to a chap last night who had been on Zoom for 12 hours that day. So I don't think that's good for you. So I think companies, and particularly HR, and maybe even more particularly the communications people, have to think about, the level of comms, the appropriateness of the comms, and probably more important than anything, the frequency of the comms. There was an article many years ago, and I can't remember who wrote it now, but they were looking at remote working, because remote working is not new. I mean, it's been around for decades. And one study suggested that we need, and forgive the slightly sexist language, it's not mine, but they suggested that everybody needs a mother hen. Everyone needs someone to keep an eye on everyone else, like little networks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think goes back to, I mentioned it in my talk, Robin Dunbar's work, where there are certain numbers that work really well if you get them cohesive, if you can help them be cohesive. So I think, announcements to all, yeah, have they ever worked? I'm not sure. But getting smaller groups managed by somebody or communicated with by somebody and doing it that way is much more effective than trying to get out to all. Now, I know that's a huge challenge if you're running a multinational organization, but nevertheless, if you want the sort of scientific stuff, that's what it is. Small groups between 5 and 15 are the easiest groups to communicate with, and groups up to about 120 people are the most effective working groups. So that is, for me, great guidance, but very, very few companies follow it. If you want to look at someone who does, look at Gore, G-O-R-E. They make Gore-Tex, the waterproof jackets. They're a multi-billion-dollar business, and they follow Dunbar's number to the letter. So they even set up their offices with a maximum number of 120 people in each office. Then they build another office. So it's scalable efficiency, as I mentioned in my talk, but it's a different type of scalable efficiency.
Mm-hmm. And as the time would come slowly, for example, here in Czech Republic, we have already people who work in corporations being asked if they want to come back, what are their thoughts on remote working. So as this culture is coming back again, back to the offices, what would you suggest? And I believe it will be still with some rules on social distancing and stuff like that. So what would be your suggestion to companies and HR specifically on, keeping people together, but still on the safe distance and in the offices, and how to attract people back into the offices? Because some of them really enjoy, like personally me, I enjoy being at home because I have a time to do some stuff, but I understand also that I need a discipline. So, but there's some people that are really enjoying it. So what can HR do to, attract them back into the offices?
Well, again, as I said in my talk, I think keeping things simple is probably the best thing. Don't get pulled into another fad. Don't get pulled into another suite of human capital measures. Keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Listen to people. Listening is like touching at a distance. It's a beautiful thing. And very few companies get it right. They have, listening groups and, talk with Dave or whatever they call it. But really breaking it down to smaller groups and listening to what people are thinking and feeling. Because, there's going to be an awful lot of people are very worried about this. COVID in many ways is a dress rehearsal. And as a biologist, none of us found this a surprise. There's been viral outbreaks every 10 years for over 100 years. And we're just lucky that COVID is a low morbidity, it kills 0.3% of the population, virus. What's it going to be like with the next one? If it's a bad one, a really bad one. And that doesn't lessen the impact of this one. But, I think we need to be thinking more about, care and about the way. It's ironic because I remember my first senior HR job. My job, it was horrible because my job was to close down an entire organization's welfare structure. I had to close it down. I had to close down the sports teams, the debating clubs, the cinema clubs, the cricket teams, you name it. I had to close it down across a whole company. That was in the 1980s. Gosh, we missed that. And a lot of HR professionals say, oh no, that's not strategic. It is strategic. It's just difficult to measure. It doesn't mean it's not important. And I think we get deflected from that. So I would like to see a lot more of that coming back. I would like to see companies caring more about their people. And it's really, it's funny in a sense, but we've been here before. We've been here before. So that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah. I mean, it's like let's call it like war in corporations between the people that go into data. They're all about data strategics, statistics and all of that. And there are people like HR, more creative people that have their ideas of how to work with people. And I also believe we even had another speaker talking about the empathy that. Especially as HR leaders, we have to be as much empathetic to people as possible, and listening is the first step to it.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't.
Where in an HR professional's training is empathy?
Yeah.
You know, where is it? I mean, this is a huge challenge, and I've been there. You have an engineering problem at work. Who do they go to? The head of engineering. They have a marketing issue at work. Who do they go to? The marketing professional. They have a people issue. Who do they go to? Themselves or their mates. And I think that's a credibility. And I know that's a general statement, but and it's not all the same, always the same in all companies. But I think there is a skill issue there. There's a definite capability issue. And I'm not having a go at any HR professional here. It's really tough, this stuff. But remember what I said earlier. We don't know how a mouse works. We have no idea how human beings work. It's so complex that it's very, very difficult. And I think the HR profession, and I'd like to see it not called HR anymore, but the HR profession has a huge opportunity here to do what you just described. But whether we have the talent I think we've got the talent, but whether we've got the capability to do it is an entirely different question.
Yeah, especially these days, like after everything happened, I think HR is one of the most important departments and sections of the organizations, and so many things just fall on their backs because of it. So I think the value of HR is growing these days, which is very important in my opinion also.
I agree.
And of course, training HR people, and because HR are also expected to be about numbers, sometimes. So training people to be more empathetic and listening to understand the people is very important. Okay, I don't see any questions at this point. So Scott, I invited you to LinkedIn group. You can also connect, you can follow on YouTube. You can find Scott on LinkedIn as well and connect with him personally if you wish. Feel free to ask any questions on our LinkedIn group. Thanks a lot, Scott. Thank you for a great presentation, for the insights. It was great to work with you to put this event together with your help. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure to meet you all. Thank you very much for joining me, guys. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.